Hi, Paul. It's
Hi,
Allie. Thank
Ali.
you so much for taking some time to talk with us today. I really appreciate it.
My
So,
pleasure.
I'm really fascinated by the work that you've been doing. I'm really glad that Jason was able to get connected with you at GLS.
Hmm.
Is that right? That's where you guys got
Yes.
together?
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
And he shared with me, just sort of in an email, several emails about different people that he had met and was working with. And in your case, he said, oh, and he's got this work on a game called Gone Home. And
Hmm.
I was like, that sounds vaguely familiar. And so I went back and I was like, yeah, where have I seen that before? And then I realized, oh yeah, I've gone and played that game before, in fact, and looked at it in some depth because I had seen it, being promoted in other places. And I was like, this looks really interesting. And so at some point, either we had earlier contact or something, but somehow or other I got connected to what was going on there. So I'm really interested in what it is that you're doing and what it is especially that you're finding around gender relationships with technology and with these games that you're developing. I think that that's really
Hmm.
awesome. So I'll let you sort of introduce and
Sure.
background on where you're coming from.
So I'm a lifelong gamer. I've personally been interested in games my whole life, all types of games, board games, video games. And when I did my master's in educational technology, my focus was on games and specifically video games and their potential uses in the classroom. I'm an English and media studies teacher. I teach grade 12 English to all the grade 12s at my school. It's an all-boys school. And I teach media studies to the grade 11s. And I would venture to say that English is one of the more difficult subjects in which to incorporate video games in a meaningful way for any number of reasons. There's always the negotiation of violent content. And unfortunately, games that have great stories, that have narratives that are worthy of study, often have unnecessary violent content. And I don't have a problem with violent content, but I do have a problem when it actually disrupts the narrative or is not meaningfully sort of reflective of the narrative. And that's been a problem for me to incorporate games into my practice. Uh, Really, it's actually my choice in the sense that I come from a community and my school is open enough that I think if I made a good argument for using a game that included some graphic violence, they would probably let me go through with it. But I feel that I want to maintain a certain quality of the types of text that I use in my class. And I feel in the gaming world, and people who are not invested in education, people who are invested in the gaming world, criticize games like, for example, BioShock, one of the best video games ever made, that has a fabulous and rich storyline with great character development. But because of the need that commercial games have to sell to a first-person shooter audience, the game added a lot of unnecessary violence to the game, which in fact is not reflective of the narrative. And they call this in the gaming world ludonarrative dissonance, where the narrative and the mechanics of the game are not in cohesion with each other. So all of this to say that I've been looking for the right game, and I refuse to use a video game simply because I love video games and I'm dying to use video games. I've been looking for the right game to incorporate in my practice. The other inhibiting factors are that many video games can take up to literally hundreds of hours to complete. The average tends to be about 15 or 20 hours. And that makes it a little bit unwieldy in certain classroom situations. So when Gone Home came on my radar almost exactly a year ago, it literally sort of checked every box. I mean, it was a game that could be finished in 3 hours. There was no gratuitous violence. There was a strong emotional content, a great gender theme, which I felt was really important to explore from a boy's perspective, and I think that it was a rich text that would yield, in many cases, as much as a literary text would, just in a slightly sort of different way. And interestingly enough, historically, the game was designed by 4 people who came from the BioShock titles and who felt that they wanted to focus on the story or narrative element, devoid of the violent content. And not because they shy away from violent content, but as artists, as people who wanted to create a game whose mechanics were meaningful to the narrative or in collusion with the narrative. They ventured forth and created Gone Home, which is basically extracting the best narrative qualities from the games that they designed while working for the BioShock titles, but not compromising the artistic integrity of the game. Well, that's a great question, and ironically, I'm currently writing an article for Edutopia about a school in Norway that uses a bunch of violent games to teach things like ethics and narrative. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about exactly this topic. In my particular instance, in my particular school, because we are a private school, we are not held to board-wide standards or district-wide standards. We make our decisions internally. It's a much more sort of direct environment where they trust me, they know me, and they make decisions on an individual basis based on a strong argument. When you're dealing in a public school situation, there are more contingencies, more stakeholders, and I think that there's a sentiment that they have to default to a circumstance where they appeal to everybody. And rather than risking, sort of an outcry from any number of groups that may be involved, I think they just would defer to not have to deal with violence at all. And I think it's a huge mistake. And I'll tell you why I think it's a huge mistake. Because these kids are going home and playing violent games every day. These kids are not given a guided or structured way to look at those games or absorb those games. The schools are leaving it to parents, and parents aren't always available or knowledgeable in a way to constructively frame their children's use of not just violent games, but they're consuming violent media. And as a result of that, I think that schools actually have a responsibility to address violence in games and to use the violence that appears in games and other media as a launch pad to have constructive and guided discussions. I mean, it's the same as sexual education. I mean, there are people that worry that by having sexual education in schools, you're encouraging kids to have sort of sex at an age where it's probably not ideal or appropriate. But we've come to learn that no, we have to guide them, and we have to take this in as part of our curriculum, and hopefully with enough research and with enough models, like the school that I'm in discussions with in Norway, like some private schools that are able to do this sort of thing, there's going to be a greater understanding that empathy can actually be built by using games that have violent content in the curriculum.
Very interesting. Thank you. So, but going home really fit the bill, and so you've been using it with the boys in your school this year?
That's right. This is the first year I've used it. I also have a colleague who works in a school in Connecticut, the Fairfield Country Day School, who I'm designing a game with right now. We met at a conference a few years ago, and he also used the Gone Home unit pretty much exactly as I devised it with his grade 9 students, also all boys, and had an incredibly successful. And I have to say, the experience with my guys was phenomenal. And it's really great because these guys are, 17 and 18-year-old boys, very media savvy, somewhat cynical at times. And it's always a little bit of a risk to bring a game like this, because this isn't a game that has, the things that typically are considered to engage boys, which is a lot of shooting, a lot of killing, and that type of thing. It's actually a very emotional game. It's a very sensitive game. And they really, really enjoyed the experience. They reflected on it in a very sophisticated way. They wrote these brilliant reviews that they posted on public sites. They did all these sort of group presentations that focus on a variety of issues within the game and topics within the game. And overall, I'd have to say that it was one of the most successful units that were carried out all year. And the thing that was also interesting is that it yielded as rich a response mechanism as any novel, play, or short story would have. The way that I addressed it was a little bit different, but I definitely drew it apply to a literary study or a traditional literary study.
Fascinating. And so, your sense of why it worked in this particular case, I'm sort of interested in unpacking that a little bit. What do you think it was about that experience, since it isn't kind of a prototypically the way game, that we might look at something like Assassin's Creed, or we might look at civilization, and these are games that boys love to play, and we have all kinds of violent themes within them, and yet when you talk to boys about what they're actually getting out of it, there's a lot of really interesting things coming out of that.
Right.
This kind of case, because it doesn't fall into those kinds of genres. It's a different genre of a game. So why do you think it works so well?
Okay, that's a great question, and I have a bunch of theories that I'd be happy to share with you. Well, first and foremost, we can't undermine the beauty and the novelty of the idea of playing a video game at school,
Yeah.
right? Just simply the fact that you're playing a video game at school of any sort is an exciting prospect and will immediately get you sort of some points in terms of engagement, regardless of what the game is. It means that they're
Now, I want to interrupt you just a second, because that's not true of educational.
pardon me?
That doesn't seem to be true of educational games. You know,
Well, that's the thing. I should also specify that because it's a commercial game, a game that and what's called an indie game, which has credibility, particularly with the people that are in the know, in the class of gaming culture, that certainly buys it sort of a lot of credibility. Now, one thing I should say about our system is that the only mandatory subject in grade 12 in their senior year is English, is my course. So there's a lot of boys that are taking English that don't necessarily want to be there. So for them, it's also a break from reading or for doing sort of carrying out traditional English activities that they may not want to be carrying out. So it's not just the fact that they're playing a game, it's a break from doing things which they may be a little bit more reluctant to do normally. But you're absolutely right. The fact that it isn't an instrumentalized sort of game and a game that's made for the purposes of education definitely holds more credibility with them. They definitely smell something inauthentic about an educational game, and they're much more willing to buy into a commercial game. And there's more artistry in a commercial game. And these are very savvy media consumers. So on a more tangible level, not just simply, they get to play a video game and they liked it. One very, very important element about teaching boys, and probably also with girls as well, but I know this as a guy who's taught boys for 12 years, is agency. A video game allows them to make choices and to see the consequences of their choices. They feel, even though they're still sitting at their seats while they're doing this, the game gives them the illusion of mobility. They're actually moving around. They're making a left turn or a right turn. They're taking this note. They're taking that note. And as a result of that, I think that there's a liberation in that. There's a feeling of freedom. And oddly and almost paradoxically, there's a freedom. There's a sense of embodiment, right? Even though it's not embodiment. You're in a video game, and there's the kind of simulation of embodiment, which is very important for boys. They're very kinetic. They like to move around. They're very tactile, and as a result of that, the game gives them that opportunity to sort of exercise those needs. I think on another level, it's a choice-based dynamic. It's a choice-based media. They're making choices within the game, which is an extension of the notions of agency. But not only that, in the responses that I gave them, the ways that they responded to the game, they also had a great deal of choice. They choose the topics that they were going to track. And the way that I set up the response mechanism is that it didn't inhibit the way that they encountered the game. It didn't say you had to go here and find this. It basically allowed them the freedom to explore the house as they would. They just had to be mindful of finding certain elements that fed into the topic that they'd chosen to pursue while they were in game. So I think that part of the success was that freedom, the freedom that they had not just in how they consumed the text, but the degree of freedom that they had in how they responded to the text as well. I also feel that, and I think every school is different, every demographic is different. Even within boys, there are subcategories of boys. And I feel that I do have a fairly sensitive and communicative bunch of boys. Our school culture is one that promotes communication. It's one that promotes sensitivity. It is a very open and liberal culture. We've had boys come out in public, at some of our assemblies. We have openly gay teachers at the school. We communicate very openly about personal matters when possible. And this game lends itself to that type of culture and that type of environment. It's a game about a girl who's essentially coming out in 1995 in a religious household. And I think that's what's important is not only do they identify with the difficulties that come with any adolescent romance, but they also see the added layer of having to come out in what may not be a widely accepted form with your family and with your community. And I think that's a great sort of starting point for debate and discussion. And one thing that I was really impressed by and really surprised by, to be honest with you, is I thought when they came to the point in the game that they realized that the main character was gay and that she was coming out, that this would be the big sort of twist in the story. It was absolutely irrelevant. It was so normalized by these boys that they only really discussed it in terms of a relationship instead of in terms of a gay relationship. And it really speaks to the culture, the community, and also the time. The fact that we are living in a time where there are many openly gay couples on television and in movies, where gay marriage is being accepted, and it's really nice to see that at least in our sector, that it has come to the point that it is almost completely, at least seemingly completely, normalized. These boys are smart enough to know as well that it's not really an environment for them to show negativity. So if any of them harbor negative feelings or are willing to jab each other in the hallway with some kind of a homophobic remark, it certainly wouldn't appear in the classroom because they know that's not the space for it to happen.
So choosing your content or choosing your game is a very difficult task, as you kind of mentioned. You said, hey, I'm looking for these check marks that I'm able to bring into my class to relay this content over. And so my question isn't so much about how you chose the game. My question more so is, now that you've got this game that you like and you see that the content matches up, how does that kind of play out with the students and your design of the class as to how you're going to bring the game and the play of the game and the experience of the game now into something more, how do we say, concrete, more contextually sound, more traditional, as it were, so that we can say, okay, they've gained something, they've learned something. So how does that process transfer from experience, play, into here's the concrete, content, and you understanding, what I'm trying to teach you?
Great. So it's interesting because it's on one hand, it's very traditional. I took a game that had strong literary roots and treated it very much like I would any other form of literature. And the types of responses, I mean, you could write an essay if you wanted to about Gone Home. You could write a book report about Gone Home. I went a different route because they just wrote long essays and I wanted to give them a little bit of a break from formal writing. So I thought that a meaningful response mechanism was writing a review. A review has emerged as a very important form in the 21st century, not just in the gaming world, but pretty much every industry now is relying on customer reviews. And I believe that there should be a certain amount of literacy around these reviews, right? Being able to spot reviews that may be sponsored by the entity in question. It's called astroturfing, where you actually hire people to write reviews for you. So I felt that a review would be a meaningful way for them to think about the game, to critique the game, and to exercise some critical thinking on their part. The other advantage of writing a review is that I find that much of what we do in schools doesn't have traction in the real world. They write an essay, they get it back, and it goes to decompose in a closet somewhere or to be ceremoniously burned in a bonfire at the end of the year. But by writing a review, what we have is an outlet, because there are hundreds of sites that allow reviews to be posted and commented on. So by allowing the boys to post their reviews and encouraging them to post their reviews on websites like Metacritic or GameSpot, they then are actively participating in a real-world community. And as a result of that, I think it makes them, it increases their desire to produce quality work, not just for the game, for the grade they're going to get, but because their work is going to be exposed and participate in the real world. And I think that's really important. So to answer your question, on one side of it is that I do use fairly traditional response mechanisms, altering them a little bit, I think, to kind of fit a 21st century scheme. The other side, and one interesting thing that really emerged from this, is listen to how your students want to respond to these types of activities. Because one really interesting story that came up was one of my more avid gamers approached me and said, I don't want to write a regular review. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take a video as I'm moving through the game and create sort of a narrative review as I take you in-game and discuss the game as I'm moving through the house. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. He's engaging in a very new and meaningful form. He's exercising a bunch of different literacies. I mean, he's got to think about what he's going to say. He's got to construct it around a three-dimensional space. He's taking us through the game. And in a sense, he's synthesizing the form of the review with the form of the walkthrough. The walkthrough is when a video takes you through a game and teaches you how to play. And I found that by now what I'm going to do is when I do this again next year, I will offer that as an option for anybody who'd like to use that. And so I'm learning from my students as well. They're teaching me what are meaningful ways to respond to content that in some ways they may be more familiar with than me or any other teacher.
Have you noticed or experienced, obviously, any tangential learning that's occurring as a result and transferable knowledge that's recurring as a result of the experience that you've offered in the classroom?
I think that the way that the unit was constructed, there was a huge gamut, I think, of learning that was going on. It's always, I mean, it's my informal assessment of it. I did have researchers in the classroom for this because I have a relationship with a university here, and they did do sort of an ethnographic study, which they've documented about the experience. And I don't really have access to much of it, so I'm speaking entirely from my perspective. But, you know, if you look at the literacies that are involved in this process, first of all, they had to learn how to play the game. And we make the mistake of assuming that all boys are gamers, all boys will instantly understand how to play games. That's simply not true. There are boys that play games very infrequently, and there's always a learning curve for using a game. Now, luckily, this game has a very easy interface, but there were boys that were nervous because they felt this was sort of uncharted territory for them. So I think there's an that's made when you go through the process of learning a new form, of learning how to negotiate a three-dimensional space, how that space works, and what that's asking of you. So I think that would definitely be sort of tangential learning. Then moving from there, they have to think critically about how they engage in the space. They're taking notes, they're taking screenshots, they're making decisions about what information is relevant or important as to what their topic was that they're choosing from. Then they move to a point where they have to think critically about the game as a whole, where they're writing reviews about the game, and they're looking at a number of different issues, including graphics, story, gameplay. So they're thinking about it from a number of different perspectives and learning how to engage with this type of media, which is becoming a prevalent form in the 21st century. Then they move to the presentation phase, and that's really important as well because they have to synthesize their information and prepare to communicate it to their classmates. And that involves putting together a slideshow and emphasizing the visual. I mean, we all know that it is ideally a good presentation does not involve a lot of bullet points and writing on the slides. You use your slides as sort of a cue, and you yourself should be the emphasis on the presentation. And that's something I really try to teach these guys. And because Gone Home is such a visual medium, it was actually extremely successful. They put together some absolutely brilliant slideshows, and they had scripts that they had become familiar with in preparation for that. So they're learning how to organize their thoughts. They're synthesizing their thoughts well. They're activating visual literacy in terms of what's important on a visual level. They're putting together and designing their slideshows, and then they're presenting the information to their classmates in a cohesive fashion. So I would, you know, from my very informal estimate, I would say there was an enormous spectrum of learning going on across a whole sort of different, realm of literacies.